Hey everyone, I'm going to do a review of the new Pentax Q that just came out about a month or so ago. I got this about a week ago and I've been playing with it a lot every day. And short, quick summary, I really enjoy the camera a lot, but I'm going to give you a little good overview and some more questions about what's good and bad about it. And so far, there are actually very few things that are actually bad about this camera. We'll talk about more things that some people have complained about or mentioned, but again, it's people's opinions, and so mine is going to be a little bit different than that. And anyway, here's the camera. As you can see, it's pretty tiny. And again, tiny compared to an SLR camera. Compared to a regular point-and-shoot, it's about the same size as a point-and-shoot that you might be carrying, except for you have this lens sticking out. But it's, generally pretty compact. It can, for something like this, it's still small. It feels really good. It's lightweight. It feels pretty solid. It's got a magnesium alloy body. I think the buttons are also metal. I may be making that up, but I need to go double check. But I believe they are. Overall, feels really solid and very good. Definitely feels like a nice piece of, technology and camera all put in one big thing together. And it's also really packed with features. Got a lot of stuff. It pretty much comes down to being a mini SLR in a small form factor. I mean, just pretty much all the capabilities you expect from SLR just shrunk down with all your lenses. So again, this is Pentax's first mirrorless camera. And if you know what a mirrorless camera is basically SLRs have a actual mirror in them that moves in and out of the way to take a photo when you press the shutter button. With the Sony Nex 5Ns and some Olympus Pen models and these kinds of mirrorless cameras, they basically don't have that actual physical mirror mechanism inside the lens anymore. So if I unhook this, what you're going to find is you're just going to see the little sensor in there. And there's no mirror that's going to stop it or open it. Instead, there'll either be a shutter on the lens to mimic that, or they actually will use what's called the electric shutter, which is basically turning on and off the sensor inside of there to mimic opening and closing the shutter. So I'm going to put this right back on. Remember, there it is. And again, if you didn't notice, the lenses are actually pretty small. I actually have a filter on here, but let me take the cap off. This is the lens that comes with it. It's a Pentax f1.9 8.5 millimeter, which comes out to being a 47 millimeter equivalent. So it's just your standard human eye perspective lens that's on there. Again, I have a little filter on here to protect the lens, so it looks a little bit bigger than it is. But if I take this off, all right, there we go. And I show you again, tiny, tiny lens, really very small, easy to carry. I mean, really nice. One of the biggest things about these mirrorless cameras and SLRs is that the lenses are so huge, they're kind of cumbersome to carry. Unless you're planning on doing a big photo trip somewhere. And having something compact like this makes it nice. And that's something I'll talk about more a little later and start comparing this to some of the other cameras. But let's go again over all the little buttons and things that's on here. So, just to be safe, put that on. First thing you notice, we have a flash, which can be used in its closed position, or if you look on the top, there's two buttons here. One is actually for the flash release. If you press that, it pops up. This is great to reduce the red eye and keep the flash away from the lens from having any problems. Again, on top, there's the playback button, and then we have your on-off button over here. How about this way? This might make it easier. Your on-off button over here, your speaker for when you hear back video playback, your shutter button, which is nice, metal, and then you have two dials here. Your one on your thumb right here is a nice metal, solid feeling, nice clicky zoom in and out kind of feature when you're doing playback, or for adjusting your shutter speed or aperture or something similar to that, whatever options are on there. Next, you have your mode button, which is of course got your standard auto, scene, blur control, which we'll talk about, manual, your aperture priority, shutter priority, program mode, and then finally movie mode. And of course, on this camera, because it's capable of full SLR, it's got a full-size hot shoe on here, which means you can use any of your standard Pentax flashes that you wanted, or any other accessories, which is awesome, because now I don't have to buy some proprietary flash unit that may or may not have the capabilities I was looking for, or work the same way I wanted. Back to the front again, which we kind of skipped over, you'll see the infrared sensor, which works, I think, up to 5 meters, I believe, up the front. This is the autofocus assist beam, which is important, which you usually don't have on a SLR sometimes. And SLRs kind of do something else with a flash that can help focus it. You have your lens release shutter button right here, and the two little holes on both sides that you kind of see right here are your stereo sound, which it records for your movies, and this new smart effects kind of button that Pentax has put in, which is a nice little shortcut to switch between different effects or aspect ratios for your images, or applying other kind of digital filter effects, things like that. Fortunately, you can't set everything from here, so I can't set, say, one position to be a raw format file at this aspect ratio and this filter on it with this color setting. You can't combine layers, which I think if they ever do end up doing it eventually for maybe the other cameras, or maybe with a firmware upgrade if it's possible, that would make this extremely flexible and compact. Otherwise, it actually works really, really well. You're just limited to one types of filters to be assigned to these controls at a time, which still is really nice, actually, and it's really great for me when I want to switch from normal camera, normal shots to black and white, or vice versa, or something else. So that works totally good. Now, back on the other side again, you have a nice 3-inch 460K dot screen. You also have a infrared sensor for wireless remotes on the back as well, which works up to 5 centimeters. So this is great if you have your stuff on a tripod and you're shooting something, and you don't want to shake the camera by accident by hitting the button, and you don't want to use a timer. You just want to be able to wirelessly fire off. You can now do it from the backside also, which is really nice. You have your little trash button, which also is a green button, which Pentaxes have a lot of this green button option, which is basically a programmable button to be used for other things. You have your plus minus for your exposure control and for other functions coming in. Your ISO button, timer button for either high speed shooting, delayed shots, white balance, and flash controls, and then your OK button. And on the bottom, your info button, which is also something that Pentax does for changing, for as a kind of a quick menu for changing options that you kind of use the most, and then finally your main menu button. Okay, now let's talk about the bottom of the camera. There's a nice metal mount here for the tripod. There's also an HDMI and PCAV connection right here. I use an HDMI D cable, which you can find online for relatively cheap. And then, like I said, the one more thing I wanted to mention again is that the hand grip that's on here actually works really well. Camera's great to hold in the hand. It feels really good, easy to shoot single-handedly. You don't, again, just built very well, and really with the photographer's usability in mind for how you want to use the camera. Everything's kind of where you'd expect it to be, and works a little bit how you'd want it to work. And if it doesn't work the way you want, there's a lot of custom options to make it work that way. So we'll talk about those in a second. Alright, let's turn this camera on. I'm going to just click on it, and you can hear like the dust cleaning mechanism fire off, just like in most cameras. It's going to boot right up. It does take it about a second or two to start, and right now it's already in movie mode, but I'm going to switch to auto mode first. Go ahead and take off the cap. And what you can again see on the main screen, in auto pick mode, you'll see this mode change between face detect, macro mode, landscape mode. It'll try to pick a scene mode that it thinks it's good for. You have no flashes on or off. Your firing mode is a single shot, multi-shot, delayed. Your white balance. This, if you can kind of tell, is basically your color. So if you want a vibrant or bright setting for your colors, or maybe a monochrome setting, has those adjustments there. Your metering mode, in this case that's on spot right now, they've set it. Anti-shake is on. Your battery, number of obviously pictures left, your ISO, your aperture, and then finally your shutter speed. Still displays all that nice information for you in manual mode if you want. And if I want to, I can always press the info button over here, and I can use my quick menu to go change some of these settings between JPEG, megapixels, the aspect ratio, yada yada yada, and come right back out. Press again, and then I'm back to this. Auto mode is nice. Like I said, it's just like any other camera's auto mode. It's going to work as it is, and it's going to, since this works on contrast, detect, autofocus, it's going to look for the most, obviously, highest contrast level things, objects, and focus on those first. And focusing's not too bad. At first I was a little sketchy about it, and I wasn't really sure that it was working that great, but then as I started using it more, it works just as fast as a point and shoot. It's a little under a second, and I can't say that's any worse than, say, my SLR would focus on something else. Oops, I just took a photo. But anyway, halfway, just like any other camera, halfway to hold down to focus, and it'll start focusing away. Now, sometimes this can have a problem where it's not able to detect the contrast, such as if I pointed at a wall that's, all the same color, and suddenly it's getting all confused and it doesn't know what to do. But that happens on every camera I've ever seen. So it's really not the camera's fault. That's just a general thing that doesn't work well for most cameras. And of course, if you say, you know what, I don't really like, focusing on that, and that's great, but I think it didn't really do a good job. Maybe it meant to focus on somewhere else and isn't what I wanted. Well, you can always turn the manual focus ring, and as you guys can probably barely see it, but it's actually focusing in and out. And I can fine tune the adjustment, and then I can take the photo and click all the way. I'm going to go into a big little spiel about how the focusing works and some little interesting things I found about how it works and does. And actually, at first I thought something was broken. There was a firmware bug, but apparently no, it's actually correct. And there's a couple of things that you can do to adjust that. But like I said, focusing's great. Low light, your auto assist beam is going to come on, and it's going to do its best, like every camera, to try to focus on it. And sometimes it'll work. It'll work just as good as any other point and shoot. So I really can't say it's any worse or better. It'll work just as well. And it said in low light, this actually beats my SLR because my SLR doesn't have an autofocus assist beam. So there's no additional light that'll ever show on the subject unless I turn my flash on, which I have my SLR here. Look, it's also white. It's amazing. So your regular, this is the KX, Pentax KX. It doesn't have an auto assist beam. So in dark or low light situation, it's really struggling to focus, and it starts hunting, which means it'll continually go in and out of focus trying to find something to get. And one way to get around that is if you turn your flash on, which Chris is not going to let me turn on here. There you go. Pop that flash on. What'll happen is when you start focusing, it'll actually... what's going on? There you go. It'll actually start flashing or strobing the flashlight to give the focusing mechanism some light to focus on the subject. But as soon as you do that, you need to actually go back and then flip it to manual mode and then close the flash, because the flash will fire as soon as this is up. But it's one quick trick to get it to get some light, focus correctly, and then switch around you can do. Otherwise, you're kind of stuck. There's really not much else you can do unless you get some other light source on there to get it to focus, or you manually focus, which... Again, if you're in low light situations or in the dark, it's hard to focus anyway. And if you're in kind of near dark, almost near dark situations, you really can't focus at all, which is pointless. But the Q, on the other hand, because it has that beam, because it's just like a point and shoot in similarity sometimes, right? It's got that beam extra on there to help it focus, and it'll focus right away in dark things, low light situations, which is good. And if it doesn't, you can always manually focus it. And again, it's not perfect. I've had it mess up sometimes last couple of days where it focused too far or too close. And like, well, okay, it did its best. It got pretty close sometimes. But, nothing's ever going to be perfect if you let the machine do it. But it does a good job. Other thing to mention is that this camera's focusing distance with this lens is about, I think, 2 feet. Something around 2 feet. So I was focusing around stuff about this close or closer, and it had trouble, which was my fault because I didn't realize it was that close. Because on most point and shoots, you can shoot pretty close. Their macro mode will kick in and so on and so forth, and it'll let you shoot this close or this close from the camera's lens. But this camera needs it about this far, which is actually about standard for most lenses on SLRs. You don't really shoot this close in a macro mode. Point and shoot just kind of get away with. However, if the auto mode's macro mode kicks in, it will actually focus a little bit. It'll actually kind of blur a little bit. It'll try, but sometimes it won't go in. You can force it into macro mode with the C mode, and then it'll actually let you go a little bit closer if it doesn't figure it out. Or, which is even better, you can actually just take the manual adjustment, and you can get it actually to force it to focus super close, which is what I like. I just say, well, if I'm in macro mode or I want to shoot something close, I just halfway focus, and then I just use the lens, and it'll let me actually focus this. It'll let me focus this close to the lens, which is actually nice. You can force it that way. Okay, let's see. So, okay, I want to shut this off now. Okay, now let's talk about the actual buttons in each mode. So we were in auto mode originally. In auto mode, you can change the ISO, and it gives you 2 options, which is nice. You can either hard set auto mode to always be a certain ISO, which the lowest on this case is 125, or you can give it a range. Say you wanted to go from only up to 1 to 1600 ISO. Great. Or you can give it the full range to go up to 6400. Okay. up to you. Nice that you have both options available in auto mode, so you can pick and choose what you want. In auto mode, and actually in some of the other modes, what you'll find is that the shutter speed, its goal will always be to try to get a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. That's generally a good speed to be at if you're doing anything handheld. You don't want to go generally below 1/60th of a second normally, to avoid any kind of blurry shots from handshake or stuff like that. But since technology is kind of improved and the anti-shake mechanism is there, and I can generally hold pretty still, I can go down a lot lower than 1/60th of a second and still get a good shot. But in general, the little auto mode and its little computer inside is going to pick 1/60th as a nice safe zone. So what you'll find is that it's going to keep updating the ISO to its maximum value that it can get away with to try to get this up to 1/60th. Now, since this is a fixed prime lens, it's stuck at 1.9, so this isn't going to adjust anymore. But it definitely will try to, if I open this ISO all the way up to the maximum, it's going to say, about 2000 ISO gives me a 1/60th a second. And it's going to stay at 1/60th now, as much as it can, and just keep adjusting the ISO instead. Again, makes sense, because if you're a normal user and you're not really, a photographer, and you're not really sure exactly what you're doing, you rather get the picture on the camera than get a blurry one that looks maybe better quality. So again, I can't blame Pentax or other manufacturers. They do the same thing generally for most of the cameras to give people the shot, and and you get your little thing. So that's one thing to consider. Your timing modes work the same. You have single frame shooting, high or low shooting, 2 seconds, or timer delay. Whatever. Okay, 2-second timer delay. You also have wireless remote control shooting, wireless delayed shooting, which is again nice, or wireless continuous shooting. Ooh, again, all nice features. And by the way, if you have the wireless remote from Pentax, or you have a third-party one like I got for cheap for like $5-10 off of eBay or Amazon, there's usually a shutter release button and then also a zoom control. That zoom control will actually let this camera autofocus on a subject too wirelessly. So if you have your camera set up and say you're trying to take a picture of yourself, right? You have it on tripod, you're looking at the camera, well, you don't know what to autofocus it to, well, no problem. You can just press the button, it'll autofocus the camera for you, and then you can start clicking it. This is awesome if you do video blogging or other stuff, and I'm sure other cameras have this feature, but this is the first time I've seen it on this one. My old SLR didn't have it, and it can kind of be a pain in the ass when you're getting the camera up there, and then you need to kind of guesstimate or estimate or set the lens to the right distance for focal length and get it all working. This way you can just automatically zoom in, start recording, and then move off, and it's great. And of course you also have exposure bracketing, which you can set, and also does remote exposure bracketing. Again, lots of options that this camera does. For white balance, I can adjust it in auto mode. It stays the same. And flash, you get a smaller set of flash functions. There's actually a lot more available in some of the other modes, which I'll show you. But you get your standard auto flash red eye reduction, flash on, and again you can do your exposure compensation. You can adjust the power of the flash up to 1 EV or -2 EV, which is good. Again, another, like I said, just like an SLR, you'd get those same features normally. And then you have flash on, forcing it on with the red eye reduction. So nice set of flash options. And let's get out of this EV bracketing mode for a second. And again, I can always also hit the AV button on the camera and then start manually using the little turn wheel adjusting your exposure compensation if you wanted to set something different. So it works pretty good. Really nice. Again, in info mode, I can go back and change my metering mode. It doesn't have to be in automatic. You can do spots, center weighted, multi-segment. Your aspect ratio, JPEG or RAW or both. All your quality features, yada yada yada. So again, nice standard stuff. Just like if you've ever used a Pentax, works the same way. Alright, now let's go over scene mode. Scene mode. In the camera, there's a bunch of scene modes. So we'll go walk through real quick all of them. You have your portrait, and it gives you a nice little help screen. Landscape, macro, moving objects for, sports and stuff like that. Night scene portraits, sunsets, blue sky, night scenes for if you're on a tripod and want to do a lot of low light shots. HDR light shots, which will actually take 3 images and stack them to reduce the noise. If you remember a review from the Lumix TS3, it did something different as well. Same kind of thing where it will stack multiple shots. This one only does 3 images, but I think they're at the full resolution to stack them. And then you have handheld night snaps, food, quick macros, pets, kids. Actually, quick macros is one of the ways where you can actually force it to zoom in closer if you want to use that C mode. Again, and forest, which I thought was interesting. Forest is one I haven't seen before, which it's meant to take pictures through if you're in a forest or trees and there's sunlight coming through some of the limbs and branches and stuff to capture that. Surf and snow, HDR mode, backlight silhouette, candlelight, stage lighting, and museum mode where you can't use flash. So kind of your standard set of scene modes, but it gives you, again, a very nice option, huge bunch of variety, and it'll pick through those, and you can kind of set them and play around with them. You can't set the ISO on some of them. I think on most of them you can't set. You may or may not be able to set the ISO. It depends on the mode. But most of the other, like this case, flash is not available in the dark and light setting. Can't change white balance. All I can do is change maybe single frame this. But again, it'll depend on which mode you're in, what settings you get appropriately. All right, so that's that. Let's go talk about blur control. Blur control is basically an option that was made to help deal with the fact that even though this is an f1.9 lens, you're not getting that shallow depth of field. So, like I'm sure most of you have seen, if you've ever seen a nice photographer's photo of a portrait, you see the girl's face all nice and sharp and focused, and slowly it starts blurring out on the outside. Her hair is a little more soft, and the whole background is this beautiful blurred mess, and you can kind of singularly focus on the subject. Those kind of focus shots are hard to do on pocket cameras, or small sensor cameras, I should really say. The reason is, there's a lot of reasons actually, but generally basing the sensor size with the way the light comes in, it's much harder to do on a small sensor. Larger sensors have a very easy time doing it, but they have the reverse problem where they can't have a hard time getting things very sharp. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Somewhere in the middle is a good camera that can do either or, right? And the thing with pocket cameras has always been that they make super sharp images, and that's great if you want super sharp images. But if you want this nice out of focus photo to get to pinpoint a particular subject and make them kind of stand out, it's hard to do with the pocket sensors. Again, since this has a smaller size sensor than a standard digital SLR, which usually has an APS size sensor or a full frame sensor, Pentax tried to solve that by making this blur control mode. And what it does is you basically focus on any subject, and it must autofocus. This is the key point. It must get autofocus lock on that subject. And you click it, and it's going to take the picture, it's going to process it, and then when it's done, you'll click back on it, and hopefully everything around it will be blurry. In this case, I wasn't that much more blurry than what it already was. But you can, if you see on the top right, there's little 3 bars here. You can actually adjust how strong you want it to be. So if I tried it again, maybe something a little bit different. Let's try focus. Yep. It'll do it. It'll process it. And since it was on the focus lock, you'll start seeing a bit. Well, I don't know if you can tell, but this is all blurred out now, all stronger. It's kind of hit or miss. It works sometimes pretty reasonably well, and other times it's completely off. So I wouldn't rely on it. It's a nice thing. It is kind of nice to have, I guess, to help it let the software blur some stuff out and create that effect. But this camera actually does a good job of doing blurred photos by itself. It isn't. It still has some depth of field, shallow depth of field, if you're up close, like most cameras. So if you're reasonably close, maybe right here, you can get blur. And if you shoot a little bit closer, you can get a nice blur on the background and get some nice blur shots. And I have photos of some sample photos of that. So you don't really need to use this. It's just if you can't come up real close and you want to fake it, all right, go ahead and turn on and on to max or middle level and focus on it and shoot it and see if you get a shot. So I'm glad they added it because it's a nice thing, and I'm sure they can improve it. But it at least gives some capability of what you could get with the large SLR. And again, it's part of the reason of the sensor size and the lens that's on the camera. And even though this is a very nice wide aperture lens, you get blur, but not as much as you would have gotten on a larger sensor with the same aperture size. And the only other way to fix that really is to get a larger lens, which you can, and I will show you that later on, because I have a lens that's gigantic for this camera. Okay, now let's talk about, let's go to aperture mode first. I'll say manual mode for last. So aperture mode, Works just like you'd expect. Same stuff. You pick your aperture, and you can see it's dropping here and increasing. I'm going to just put on the lowest one, and, the shutter speed adjusts accordingly, right? As I change it, it'll start adjusting. And, of course, I've set the ISO, same options. You can either set it to 1 or force it to arrange. Let's set it to 1, and let's just see what happens. And yeah, you can see it changing great. Yada, yada, yada. And, of course, in aperture mode, you actually get your full-on... kind of works like a manual mode, except that the aperture is locked. So you get your same settings of all your options come back open for your shooting modes, your white balances all come back, all your standard kind of white balances, and then a flash white balance, and your custom manual white balance can be set also. And then again, your flash modes now finally open up the full range. So you have flash, auto flash red eye reduction, flash on red eye reduction, slow speed sync red eye reduction, or trailing current sync, and flash off. So lots of flash modes. And the cool thing is actually on the flash, this will let you sync a flash sync of 1/2000th of a second if you use the built-in flash, which is crazy. That's huge. Otherwise, if you use an external flash, you're stuck to 1/250th of a second as your max sync speed, which is normal and pretty good range. But again, that's only if you use the higher quality Pentax lenses, which is the standard one that comes with it, and then the O2 lens, which is the zoom lens. If you use any of the toy lenses, like the fisheye or the Whiting or telephoto, you can only sync at 1/13th of a second with the flash, which there's some reasons why it does that, but with the viewfinder, but I think mainly because there's no shutter, I believe, that's on the lens that's causing it to have to go to that time, that shorter sync speed. In any case, nothing really fancy here, works the same way. So, shutter priority, same thing, just the reverse. Same options are available. You can change the shutter speed and it'll adjust, and you can keep going. So nothing really there, but nice modes to use, especially if you're with the prime lens, because you're probably going to shoot at 1.9 most of the time to get the most light in, unless you really want to shoot higher up. But keep in mind that this 1.9 on this camera for this sensor size is more like an aperture f7 on an SLR, such as my KX, Pentax KX. So you're getting about the same level of sharpness. So 1.9 is actually a nice, sharp, clear lens. So you shouldn't really have to go up too much higher than that unless you have a lot of really bright sunny day and you're trying to compensate. Finally, let's go back to program mode. Works exactly the same way as everything else, except now it's going to, if I pick something, it's going to automatically pick for the aperture, for the exposure compensation. So I can click the AV button, and it comes up, and I can change it, and all the settings adjust like we'd expect, just like we'd want it to. So very simple, very nice. Okay, let's get on that. And finally, movie mode. Movie mode's great because on this camera you can actually do full manual controls, which may or may not be what you want, because I personally just leave it on auto mode because unfortunately there's not really much else I care about other than the ISO setting that it's on and the focus. And on this one, again, I can focus in and out. You can kind of see it blurring in and out manually and adjust it. But if I were to go to menu mode, you can see me saying exposure settings to auto. You can change shake reduction on or off, the quality levels. Also interval movies, which we'll talk about. Well, we'll talk about now. You know what? This camera does interval movie shooting. So I can set the interval to shoot off every 1 second, record for up to 1 hour, start it now, or I can set a start time, which is awesome. So I can start doing interval movies. They'll just start firing every 1 second that I want for an hour. Maybe this is a minute. For 1 minute, keep firing off every minute, and it'll make a nice little time-lapse movie. So this is an awesome, great feature. I really love this a lot. Can use a lot of interesting effects, and if you go on YouTube, you'll see a lot of videos that people have already done with this that look amazing. So if you go back to exposure, and let's go to manual mode first. Let's get it out of there, and you see all your standard controls come right back up. By the way, this can only record up to 25 minutes at a time in a clip. So even though this is 99 minutes and 59 seconds, it can only do 25 minutes at a time. So as you can see, it's pretty dark right now. Well, let's go ahead and change the aperture f1.9. Let's change, as you can see, I can go up to 1/2000th of a second for shutter speed, but I can't go any lower than 1/30th of a second to make a nice 30 frames per second. And then so the only thing I have left to do is either go ISO. I can either leave it in auto mode. Yeah, see, auto mode, great. works nice. Or I can leave it set to this something. Set 1. This is great if your light conditions and you're never going to change it. That's perfectly fine. But if I was pointing at something bright and then suddenly pointing at something dark, it would never adjust. But if I change it to auto mode on the ISO, suddenly I can point it at something really bright and it lowers down. If you're pointing at something dark, it brightens back up. Ooh, it's almost like you have some control again. And this is generally what the auto mode would have done anyway. So, unless you want to force it to a particular one, but you'd have to know, what are you going to be shooting at? The sad thing, which some people were debating, is on whether this does autofocus tracking, and it doesn't. You can, I can halfway click, and it'll pick your focus spot, and that's what it'll be focused on, and it'll stay that way until you start using your manual control wheel to adjust or tune as you move it around. So, or you can also use your autofocus. In this case, I'm using actually spot autofocus. And you can use all the other autofocus modes to get your focus locked on for the camera. But after that, it's pretty much all manual only. Which I actually don't mind because I was going to do that anyway. And that's how I shoot for videos. But if you wanted something actually tracked, such as the camera I'm using right now, which is the Lumix TS3, which automatically adjusts based on your subject, this would not be the one you wanted. The TS3, by the way, can also be forced to a standard lock position. You can kind of make it focus on something and not adjust later on. But then it'll be locked there forever. But you can't manually fix it, so you're stuck. So, I can't do what you can do. This at least gives you more creative control. At least I can decide when I want something to be out of focus and in focus, and where I want, things to go. And by the way, as you see I'm turning, you see on this top left corner, you see it says turning to the right, it's more for landscape or far away, turning to the left, more for close up. Gives you a little guide so you know where to go. The shutter wheel, this manual focus is actually done just by wire. So it's not actually a physical ring actually changing something in the lens. It's just the sensor's picking it up inside the camera. Sorry, not the sensor. Well, the camera's picking up my changes and then suddenly going right into focus. And it's actually it works, it's pretty sensitive and it works pretty well. It's not like laggy like some cameras I've used where the manual focus just takes forever and it takes forever to scroll in and out and out. No, this works pretty much just as good as you would have done on your regular SLR. To focus in and out. So there's your movie mode. Does 1080p and saves in the MOV format or MOV. Doesn't do AVC HD, but hasn't really been a problem. And other than that, really nice. The quality is good. I'm still in debates if its quality is as good as the TS3, which is what I'm shooting with, or if this one's better. I have to do a little more checks, but I think it's about maybe equal to or just a little bit below. I find like this one has a little bit more. This because it's got a little bit of a lag on the camera, whereas I can kind of move up and you can see it's getting a little delayed, and so when you're turning kind of fast, you can see a little bit of what is called ripping or tearing, just a slight bit. Otherwise, really, it's not that bad. That's actually pretty good. Otherwise that's fine. It's not their number one top movie camera, but that's okay. It didn't have to be. It still takes really nice, good videos, and your effects also take an effect, by the way. And if you can see, I'm actually changing a couple different effects. Well, black and white's probably the easiest one. And those actually will apply. And that's coming from the smart button. I'm just quickly changing it in and out. So I can change the effect, start recording, do my stuff, and then, do it as it is. If I remember correctly, if you switch the effect while you're recording, I think it stops recording and it flips the effect and then you can shoot again. So I don't think you can switch effects while recording. I'm pretty sure you can't. But it's still nice that you can just flip to a particular type and record in that movie mode. So that's cool. Alright, let's go ahead and talk about the menu and the green button. So I'm going to hit the menu button here. We'll go over them real quick. Custom image lets you set all your bright, natural, portrait, landscape, yada 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 modes. And you have some custom ones that you can also set if you want, and you can adjust parameters. Digital filters, again, toy camera, high contrast shading, blah blah blah, so on and so forth. You can kind of see what's going on with that. Image capture settings. If you go into there, you can set your aspect ratio, file format RAW or RAW plus if you want to record both types. Your recording level, equality, your color space, all that kind of fun stuff. Your focus settings. We'll talk about more of this later, but you can either choose autofocus or manual, and your focus methods. There is face detect, AF tracking, which is basically you'll point at a subject, hit the down button here, and it'll lock on and then track that continuously. So this is kind of like the continuous autofocus tracking that you might want. Or your standard 25-point autofocus grid, or a selective spot, so if you want to be able to move your focus point by clicking OK and then adjusting it, or just center focus. I always keep mine on center and movable, just because it's out of habit. Also, there's manual focus assist, which can be default to 2 or 4 times. I'm going to leave this on 4 times for now, because I'm going to show you something a little bit later. Your metering modes, evaluative, center weighted, and then spot. And then there's also an ND filter. In bright days, because this can only go up to 1/2000 of a second, it may not be able to keep out enough light with all the higher aperture setting and ISO and shutter speed. So this is a built-in neutral density filter, and what that do will cut the amount of light coming in by about 1 stop, I think. And you can turn it on or off as needed if you need to use it. I've only had to use it once when I'm pointing at something really bright, or on a really bright day, and there's just the way, for whatever reason, how I want to shoot the photo, just I need that extra bit of reduction. You can always just get it a regular standard neutral density filter that fits on here, and use that too if you want to. If you want a little bit better quality than the ND filter that's built in. I think this makes the quality go down a little bit, but I didn't notice any difference. So, supposedly it makes quality slightly, possibly worse, maybe. HDR capturing can be turned on and off. Multi-exposure, this is cool. This lets you actually take, as many, up to 9 shots at a time, and actually do multi-exposures, which back in the old day, if you had film, you'd shoot a shot, and then you'd not turn the wheel so much again. You'd just have it re-click, and you'd just re-expose another shot on top of it. So just to show you how this kind of works, I'm going to say start shooting, so I'm going to pick like this white door. That's good as took it, and notice, look, there's a ghosted image on it, so now I have 1 exposure on top. And then I'm going to pick something else, and click on that, and ta-da, now I have my let's go back. So now I have my fully ghosted image. There you go, you can see that, on top of each other. So you can do multi-exposure, which is cool, because, you don't do that anymore, because people don't have that option on the digital cameras. But now it's there again, so this one has that. So let's go back to menu again. You can change your dynamic range settings for highlight correction, shadow correction, change your high ISO noise reduction settings, your distortion correction, quick dial. This is where you're going to set your little 1 through 4 buttons. So you can see there's one is smart effects, like I had the bold black and white control, build and color, tone expansion, or I can do custom images such as bleach bypass, monochrome, portrait, digital filters, or aspect ratios. So I had to pick one of these 4 types, and it'll then pick one of these 4 here that I can change any of these 4 to be out of the same family of filters or effects. I just can't combine one from here, one from here, one from here, one from here, or layer them on top yet, which would be awesome. Would be the coolest thing ever, but it doesn't do that yet. And the next one is your green button. This is where you're going to have a lot of options to set what this little green multifunction button does, and this is actually extremely useful. For right now, I've set mine to let me switch between RAW or JPEG modes, but you'll also see if you can use it for a depth of field preview button. You can also do a program shift, which is basically you hold it down and it lets you shift your shutter speed and aperture all at once if you want to change your exposure compensation. You can also do auto exposure lock or enable AF. This is another cool thing, and so I'm going to turn this on so I can show this to you later. You have your LCD options, your play, your memory, your shake reduction, yada yada. We went through all the movie mode stuff. A slideshow for playbacks. Your language, standard language adjustments, time, so and forth, so and so. HTML, blah blah blah. Not that important. Your pixel mapping, your dust removal, format firmware version. Okay, the custom menu. This is like all Pentaxes. The custom menu really makes a huge difference in my options. And I normally leave them mostly on the default, but there's some really cool stuff you can look at here, such as autofocus release options. I have it on number 2, which is shutter can be released even if subject is not in focus. This is again going to be something important that I'm going to come back to. Again, so many different options. White balance when using flash. You can have it use auto white balance when the flash is on, unchanged, or use a flash white. Just lots of cool options that really customize the camera for how you like to shoot your photos and what you want it to do and what not to do. cool. I love Pentax for doing this. They have so many more custom options that most manufacturers I don't always see have sometimes. So there's your menu, and now I'm gonna go put this down, and I'm gonna get ready to talk about the autofocus and manual focus, and some of the quirky things that it does, and how it's actually not so quirky at all after all. Okay, well, let's talk about the autofocus mode. So I've set this to the focusing method in the menu setting to autofocus, and I'm in auto mode right now. So you see the little black frame, you halfway click, just like every other camera in the world now, and it focuses on whatever it can find that looks, relatively high contrast, so it can focus on it. But now let's try look at some of the other modes. If you're in auto mode, you can't actually change the focus method. It just sticks to this top one automatically. But if you're in any other of the modes and you have autofocus selected, your focus method, you can pick some of these other options. So let's look at tracking. Tracking works, you basically have a center dot, which you can kind of see right there. And I'm going to pick some subject, halfway click, it goes green, and you can kind of see it tracking it through the frame. And if it loses it, well, then your screen thing gets stuck there, and then you try to refocus again. And then hopefully it'll get stuck there. And you can see it's just tracking it throughout the screen. Woo! Yeah, nothing too fancy there. So there's your auto tracking, kind of continuous tracking focus right there. Next thing you can do, which I just moved it. Another cool one is your 25 frames focusing, which if you see it right, it looks like it's in the center. You got the same smaller black frame, and it's kind of like a spot focus. But if you hit the OK button over here on the right, you see it changes, and I can move it to different sides, which is nice, right? Or if you see on here as a little bottom scroll wheel, if I scroll with the top scroll wheel here, it changes sizes. Ooh, even fancier. I can even go really big. So really big, smaller, smaller, like a cross shape, horizontal or vertical shape, and then I can move it along. So that's where I want to focus on, is that area. Halfway click, and it'll pick something within that side to focus on versus what you might have done. So really nice. It actually gives you some autofocus fine-tuning, which is kind of cool. So oh yeah, and by the way, if you just move it around and you hit OK button, it'll go back to the center. So you don't have to go back and place it again. So that's nice. And if you still don't like that, you have your actual spot focus with even tinier frame that'll focus on something, which is what I normally use, which is probably too small. But it's if you want to nice fine spot focus. And again, you can hit the OK button and you can move it around to something else. Slowly, but it'll move around. You can, focus there. This is good if you're on a tripod and you want to focus on something. You can adjust the focus point for autofocusing if you don't want to manually do it. And again, I can hit the OK button and it centers back. And then finally, your last mode is just your standard spot focus, which doesn't move at all. It's just stuck there. If you just want to always have it in the center. If I focus on something, you'll see it nice in there. I'm going to then go to change the manual focus ring. And notice my finger is still halfway on the shutter. And I focus on it like, yep, that looks good. I press it all the way. It takes a photo. Great. Now let's say again, I focus on it. Adjust the manual focus ring. I forget and I accidentally take my finger off. Oh no, what do? No problem. You need to press it again halfway and then press it all the way and it'll fire. It'll stay in that mode. If you forget to do that, like for example, let's do it again. I'm going to focus, change it, forget my finger, and I just tap it instead of holding it. Guess what? As soon as you press halfway again, autofocus enables. So if your autofocus was missing every time and you wanted to fine-tune it, and you let go of your finger and you didn't press again halfway, it's going to refocus every time. Because this button, the shutter halfway button, means focus. Right? So you're pretty much stuck. So you got to focus, change something, either click it, or if you forget, click it again, but stay halfway there, and then finally press the shutter button all the way. Now what if you say, well wait, okay, that's not too bad, I can remember that, just make sure your finger's on there. If you forget, just keep it held down the whole way and finish off shooting. What if I just, instead of autofocus, I just went and did something manually without using it? Well, you'd be like, yeah, that looks, let's pretend this isn't focus. Now I want to go ahead and take a picture. Well, guess what? The shutter button's over here. And every time I press the shutter button halfway, it focuses. So what happens? It's going to go back and try to refocus every time. Oops. So every time I adjust it manually, I hit the button and I try autofocus, it goes back and focuses. That'll drive you insane. But luckily there's an easy way to fix that and change that actually, which is good. So you don't actually have to do that. Again, what that means is if you have autofocus selected your focusing method, you must have a focus lock first. Then you can fine tune, and then you can either click or, if you forget, click it halfway and then fire, and you're fine. But let's say you actually didn't mean to do that. Maybe you actually want to, you want to be able to fire just in manual mode. Well, then you can just go back, change autofocus to manual, change it to manual, and then you're free to do whatever you want. You can see, let's pretend again, look, this is in focus. I'm going to click, and I fire. Click, and fire. Click, and fire. Doesn't matter. Now, no more autofocusing is going to happen. And like, oh, that's cool. So now if I want to do manual focusing only, and I want to be able to change at any point in time, I can just, turn my wheel and fire off. But sometimes, it's nice to have autofocus available, right? Sometimes it's nice to be able to switch back. You don't have to keep, switching modes between autofocus and manual, when you need it. Sometimes you want to be able to turn autofocus on a needed basis. Well, you can do that. You can actually go to the menu button, and you can go to your custom settings, go to the, let's see, go to your green button settings and change it to Enable AF. And what that does, and this works whether you're in manual mode or autofocus mode, so let's go back and show you what happens in autofocus mode. Your shutter release button halfway no longer activates autofocus. So now I'm in auto mode. Let's go back to auto mode. And hitting the shutter button halfway does nothing. It just, if I press it all the way, it'll fire eventually, right? Dink. But that's all it's going to do. It no longer focuses. But the green button does. So now I can just use my thumb, pick anything, focus, and fire. Focus. Come back. Focus, and fire. So now I've actually split the autofocusing portion between the shutter and actual green button, which is cool. So now if I go back to manual mode, again, I can fire, and look, I can even fine tune, and I can fire, and it's great. Now, whenever I want to do autofocus, if I really wanted to, I can just pick on something, and it comes back on. So now I can choose when I want autofocus or when I want it to enable or not, and you can go back to manual too. So good. So it gives you both options. So this is not too bad. You can actually, since your thumb is usually in that location, it's easy to press your thumb with the green button and the farther shutter button, or if you just already know where you are, you can just shoot. You don't have to have it actually there. And again, you can keep playing with your manual focus. So this is probably your best combination option if you like to do a lot of manual focusing, but you want to be able to enable autofocus stuff on an as-needed basis, which is nice. The other thing that's you might come across is that sometimes you might have something, if you're, let's just pretend, let's go back and change the green button not to do Enable AF. Let's just change it back to that. And suddenly, okay, you're focusing, and great. Let's pretend I'm trying to do something in macro, and I got my hand up here, and I kind of try to focus it, and it says nope, not really focusing. Oh well, yeah, great. Let's try to figure it out. Come on. Yeah, okay, there we go. Okay, I got a red mark. I was looking for a red mark. I got a red mark. You're like, okay, no big deal. I'll just manually adjust it. Yeah, manually adjust it, and then I'm going to try to shoot, right? Nope. Can't fire it. Why? Because the autofocus thinks it's red. So you cannot force it to fire. Even though you just corrected it manually, you're stuck. No! And you can't get it. Unless it turns green, it won't fire. If it's white, it'll fire. I think if it's white, it will fire. So if you sometimes it'll fire. But yeah, red, you're stuck. Not a problem. You can go again to menu mode, go to your custom settings. On the first page, on number 7, is AF release options. Change it to release priority. Lets you shoot even if it's a non-focus. And now, if you're in whatever mode you are in, you're using autofocus, and suddenly you get a red mark, you go back and great. Get a red mark, you go back and correct it, and like, yep, yay, that's what it is. Yep, I can fire now. Now I can shoot whether it's red, green, white, whatever. Doesn't care. See, there you go. I can keep firing off. This is also kind of good in low light situations where if the autofocusing doesn't work and it's kind of hunting a little bit in and out, you can cheat, and if you see it in focus on the screen, you can kind of fire off the shutter without letting it focus first, which is kind of neat too. You can kind of push it out, because sometimes they may miss it and it's hunting, and you can be like, no, I could if I could press the button right then, it would be perfect. So that's there. So I usually turn that on because just in case it doesn't catch focus, if I'm in every case where I can't find focus in like a low light situation or whatever, or a close macro mode, and I want to manually adjust it, it's pointless because you can't fire the shutter anymore. You have to actually turn that mode custom option on first and then do it. So I would recommend turning that on. Otherwise, you're pretty much good. Like I said, it works a nice combination, and I really like the fact that you can split the focusing between the green button and the shutter. So if you like to shoot a lot of manual stuff, but like me, want to do autofocus every now and then, you can. It gives you that option. Or if you want to stay in autofocus mode the whole time and just do manual as a fine-tuning, you can do that too. Or, vice versa, or however you want to do it. You get a lot of options of how you want to shoot, which I think is great. Okay, now I wanted to talk about the other benefit with the Q, is that the Q has a backlit CMOS sensor that's brand new that lets it take 2 to 3 exposure value stops higher than, say, the KX, which is really beneficial. And that's one of the things that they talked about, Pentax talks about, but should really be emphasized, that the sensor is a lot more efficient and can absorb a lot more of the light that's coming in, that helps it stay at the higher ISOs or shutter speed. So what I've done here is I got my KX, I got my Q. I'm going to wake this one back up. I've set it to about 31 millimeters view, which is equivalent to the same as the lens that's on here. So 31 on here ends up being a 50 millimeter, 35 millimeter equivalent. That's not confusing enough. And then this one's set to that. The aperture set to 7.1, which should give you the same depth of field as the 1.9 on this camera. And just to prove to you, I got them both on live view. They're going to take roughly pointing at the same place. And let me switch this to manual mode just to make sure. Okay, let's get you over here. Come on. Yep, alright. Okay, so there we got that. And I'm going to take this off live view for a second. And what I'm going to do is leave on the KX, we're going to go ahead and get it back to 0 EV, or 0 exposure, or the correct brightness and darkness level that we want. And I'm going to leave it actually at 1/60 because that would be handheld mode. So all we're going to change is the ISO, because that's probably going to be the most interesting thing first. So get this to shoot, I'd have to go to probably around... Nope, that's still not enough. Even at 12,800, I can't really get back up. And you see this little bar that coming isn't enough. So we're going to have to eventually just change this back up to 1/10 of a second at 12,800 ISO to expose correctly. For the Q, let's go ahead, and since the Q can't actually go to 12,800, let's actually drop this down to 6,400. So, and let's change this back. So this goes to 1/5 of a second. For the Q, we're going to have it focus. I'm going to go ahead and set it to aperture priority so it automatically picks the right shutter speed for me, so I can be lazy. We're going to set this 1.9. And I'm going to leave the ISO where it is, and let's see what it thinks. At ISO, let's just go ahead and put it at the lowest ISO first to see what it says. It's at 1 second at 125, and let's go to 6,400. Okay, we're at 6,400. So, same image for the correct same exposure levels. Wake up. There you go. Is going to be, just so you can actually see, well, it was at 1/50th of a second. So, 1/50th of a second for the same shot versus 1/5 of a second. That's a pretty significant difference. I think that's great. That makes a huge difference, because realistically, if I wanted to, I can keep dropping the ISO. So, and get better quality. So, for example, let's go back here, and let's change this back to a more reasonable ISO of ISO 800 for the KX. And in that case, I'd have to shoot at 1.5 seconds almost. And for the Q, changing this back up to 800 ISO. Alright, I get 1/6 of a second. Again, big difference. The other thing I forgot to mention is that this camera actually shoots about 2/3 of a stop lower than what the correct exposure is, if you want to get the right white balance and coloring and all that. So it's really, actually, the KX always shoots about 2/3 of a stop, I found, for me, under. whereas this one actually shoots correctly at the right exposure value when it's at 0. So realistically, I can actually drop this another additional 2 stops, and I'm going to go ahead and do that here. And this takes it down to 1/10 of a second versus 1.6 seconds. So big difference there. And again, the reverse happens if I kept the ISO at the lowest ISO. You see the shutter speed skyrocket up for the Q, and the KX would go up, but not as much. And even if I take the KX, you know what? Well, that aperture's not really fair. Maybe you're like, well, I don't think that's really the same depth of field. Okay, fine. So let's change this to the lowest setting with the kit lens, which is at 31 millimeters. So we have the same view, and that's about an f4. Even and at that point, the best ISO I can go to keep it. I can keep. Let's take it to again 3200. Maybe that's a reasonable ISO for you. No, let's say 1600. 1600 is fair, and we'll zero that in at at 0, which is 1/3 of a second. The Q again at ISO 1600 would end up being about 1/25 of a second. So again, significant difference, and obviously the reverse happens. So I think that's something that gets overlooked when people are judging the image quality, is that yes, it's great that KX can take better pictures in JPEG mode. Definitely JPEG, the KX wins. But when you start comparing RAW to RAW, the Q is only just a little bit behind. You're really going to see the difference of the JPEGs in low light situations, but in daylight, they're both pretty much equal. But again, what's the point if I can't get the shot out? If it's taking too long to take a shot, I'm going to get blur. I'm going to have to shoot at a higher ISO, which gets more grain. Or if I'm trying to shoot a very high-speed moving object and I want to be able to leverage that extra sensitivity and shoot at a higher shutter speed, I can with this one, I can't with this. It makes a big difference, and I think that's something that people are forgetting when they're comparing these two cameras, and if they're just looking at image quality. It really also makes a difference of what ISO and what shutter speed it was taken at to see that. So I think that's a huge advantage, and I think a lot of the newer cameras are getting better with sensitivity, so I'm sure the newer Pentaxes and obviously SLRs are more sensitive and have better things. But this is about a 2-year-old camera at this point. And again, to be able to shrink that down to a smaller compact form and get the same image quality is great and totally worth it for me. Because the KX itself was actually a great SLR. This is just an additional benefit of it. Alright, now on to the negatives about the camera. I've given a lot of good things about this camera, but there are a couple things that may not work for you, and maybe some reason why you may not want to go to trade out your SLR or take this only as a compact. And there's not too many, but there's a couple things. One is that the burst fire rate for this camera, it's stated as 5 frames per second in JPEG. What they don't tell you is they can only do that for about 1 second. So it's good for about a quick burst of 5 frames, and then you're kind of stuck. That's okay. I don't use burst firing too much, but if it's important to you, consider that a limitation. My K100 Super D from Pentax had this similar kind of limitation where it just couldn't fire off a lot of burst shots very quickly. And it was something that you kind of dealt with, and if it was something important to you, that probably wasn't the camera for you. Like a Canon or Nikon SLR was better at that time. Of course, now you can do whatever you want. But if I just change it to high shot mode, and I'm just going to let it shoot at 1/60 a second, regardless of the ISO, I'm just going to let you see it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I got about 6 out, and then you can see it hanging. And it's going to, it'll come back a little bit, but you're not going to get a continuous nonstop 5 frames per second. The KX will do easily a lot more than that. It continues for at least a couple of seconds before it starts slowing down. So that's kind of, one thing to notice about that. But for me, a quick 5 frames per second shot burst, 5-6 frames in about a second, is usually fast enough for me to get a shot personally. So again, it'll have to be up to you what you think is worthwhile. So and since I'm here, in the playback menu, by the way, you can also, obviously like most cameras, you can zoom out and zoom in and zoom to the folder level. But you can also go ahead and just delete things. So you can hit the trash button, select some images you want to delete. And let's say I just want to get rid of all those, and hit the trash button, and voila, gone. Yeah, there you go. So I'm going to actually see if I can, I'm going to switch this to RAW mode. I'm going to go down here. And RAW mode, you can only shoot at about 1 frame per second. So I'm going to focus, and that's good enough. So again, slow, but Alright, so maybe that's not what you want to do if you're shooting in RAW, so that's another bad thing about the camera, is it's not going to be able to shoot high burst fires in RAW mode. Again, if that's important to you, this probably won't replace the SLR for you. At least not this one. There's other compacts, like from Nikon, they're supposed to be they're much faster at that, and I'm not sure how that does in RAW mode on that camera yet, the Nikon J1 and V1. But for the Pentax Q, that's not really something that you want to be looking at. Again, for me, this is not a problem because I very rarely ever shoot in a burst mode like that. I usually just take one shot that's I'm very focused on what I'm trying to do, and then I take it. And the 5 frames per second is good enough for me. Second thing, as you can see the AF speed, now that it's a little bit darker, you can see the assist beam kind of coming on and off. There you can see a little bit of an orange glow, sometimes up, not able to focus. You can see as low light conditions start coming in, it gets a little bit worse. And can take a little bit of hunting, 1, 2, oh, there we found it. 1, 2, takes a little bit of time for it to sometimes find focus. It starts weakening up a little bit in the light. Even with the assist beam, that decides to come on, it starts getting weak. So that's another little thing. In low light conditions, it's about as good as your regular point and shoot. It's not going to be as fast as your SLR or something else. And to be fair, most point shoots are about somewhere in this range, and they really rely on their AF assist beam to give some light to focusing. And again, you can always focus manually, just like you could in your SLR, but comparatively, the KX is just as bad or worse actually than this, because again, it doesn't have that AF assist beam, and it starts hunting continuously before it can find focus. So for me, this is actually better than my KX in low light, just because it actually has a light beam and it's able to pick up a lot quicker. But you can definitely see it hunts. There you go. Try to focus, didn't find one, but I actually know it's in focus, so it's going to let it fire off. But that's something, again, to look at. So low light, not perfect. Not perfect for focusing. It'll find it, and as it gets lower, it can depend, but that's just something you have to deal with. I think they're all kind of iffy with since, like I said, this uses contrast detection autofocus. It's just weak in low light. It's really hard in low light to get a good focus sometimes. But in every other condition, it's pretty good. And really, except for me, this is not any worse than any other point and shoot that I'm used to. So it's acceptable for me. But that is a negative that's on there. The next thing that's may or may not be important to you, we talked about earlier that there's no shallow depth of field with the lens that comes with it. And even if you use blur control, that's a good... not good, but a secondary backup to that. But you're not going to get that shallow, perfect depth of field that you want unless you shoot close up, to get that blur. So if you're expecting to be able to shoot farther off and get those nice blurred backgrounds or subject focus, you're not going to be able to do it with the lens that comes with it. And even with the zoom lens, which I just got actually here an hour ago, it's at a larger aperture number, and you're just not going to get that same effect. So even with the prime, get some blur, not going to get the shallow depth of field, but there is a fix to that. There is actually a way to get that if you use lenses from CCTV cameras, which I'm going to talk about next in a second. But so far, those are the only really 3 things I've found that don't work well with this camera. And I think those are acceptable limitations. I understand the shallow depth of fields because of the sensor size. It's very expensive to make glass to the same level to get the same depth of field on these smaller cameras. Understandable. AF speed, not the fastest focusing camera on there, but not the worst, just right down the middle. Low light is worse, but just as good as any other point and shoot. And your 5 frames per second, you're not going to get your your super fast burst speed for nonstop. So if you're just going to hold the shutter down and just shoot all day, this is not going to be it. In that case, just take a movie. You have a better option by doing that. All right, now onto the fun stuff. Almost done with my review here. I know it's a long review, guys, but I want to give you a little comparison with everything. On the left, we have our KX with the body, the 18-55 kit lens, and my 50mm 1.4, which would be your fast prime lens that you would want to use if you want a lot of depth of field and lots of fun, good shots and things like that. Comparatively, here's the the Q with its zoom lens, which ends up being actually a 22 to 83mm, but similar range that what you'd expect. Just a little, not as wide, just a little bit less wide, just kind of shifted over a little bit, but again, compare the sizes. Those are those two to compare with. You kind of see how big they are. And then my 50mm, which is gigantic looking now, to the prime lens. Again, tiny, tiny, tiny lenses. Tiny, tiny, tiny lenses. And just to get a little more light. And by the way, I also have the fisheye lens, which is their number 3 fisheye lens for the Q, which, again, the cap is bigger than half the lens. And getting a fisheye lens is expensive for most cameras, for most SLRs. This is about $130, so very reasonable fisheye lens. I never would have bought one if it wasn't that price range, and because it's not something that I really used to shoot with. So having an opportunity that I wouldn't have had before makes a lot of sense. The prime lens comes with the Q, which is great. It's a good starting lens to use, and then the zoom lens, it retails for about $300. But it's their high level lens, so it's got a shutter and supports all the features of the camera and autofocus and 1/2000th of a second flash sync speed with the built-in flash and all the junk that's on there. So again, you can see it's not very nice, very smooth. It's got your manual focus ring here and your zoom, just if you want to see. It comes out. And also very nice build quality, all metal construction. So, and very light. So comparatively, you can either have these two things together, or you can have this thing together, these two things together. And it would be equivalent, basically, in kit-wise. I'd rather take the small one. That's my personal preference, but since, again, the quality of images is as good as that, and I can put these in my pocket and go home and not worry about it, I think I'd rather take these two. Makes a big difference. Nice for editions. Okay. So, again, talking about the lenses, with the Q, it's a brand new Q mount. So, you might be saying, well, I wish I had a little more lens choices. Pentax has 2 other lens choices, which is their other 2 toy lenses, which is a wide angle for about $90 and a telephoto for about $90. Nice lenses, but I feel if you're going to spend $90 for both of them, you might as well just get the zoom, which covers the same ranges. The telephoto goes a little bit farther, but I think it's worth it just to get the nicer zoom that's got more options, got all the stuff on it. Now, the Q also has the other benefit. Since it is an interchangeable lens camera, you can hook it up to stuff like a telescope or a spotting scope or other lenses. I actually have the adapter that'll go from a Q mount to a C mount for CCTV lenses, and from that to the regular standard Pentax KX lenses, which means I can start using these big giant lenses on the Q. Now what that's going to do for me is, because the Q has a 5.56 crop factor, this 50mm lens is going to be about 260, 270 millimeter telephoto lens suddenly at 1.4 aperture, which is huge. Which means now I just got a pocket super zoom with this one lens attached on. Same with my wide angle. This will become a nice wide angle, telephoto zoom instead of just a regular zoom. And if I go really crazy, I can hook up this guy, which is a 70 to 200 millimeter to the Q, which is my nice big lens. And this will end up becoming like about a 1200 millimeter telephoto lens at the max focal length, which is crazy. So I can basically, instead of buying these thousands and thousands of dollars super telescopes for zooms and ranges, and carrying these big amount of equipment, I can just basically buy my Q and get one of these, which is a standard cheap lens, which I got this for $15. So yay for me. And I get a pocket super telephoto, camera. And if that isn't enough, and that still wasn't enough, you're like, well, that's great, but I want something with more shallow depth of field and more range of options, maybe in a single lens. Ta-da! This is a CCTV lens with a C mount, and this goes from 8mm to 48mm, which on the Q means it goes from about equivalent in 35mm terms of 46mm to 267mm. So this is, again, a big zoom range from filling in the gap from the prime lens all the way to a pretty good telephoto zoom, all also at an aperture of 1, which means the lens is gigantic, huge. This thing is about as big as the Q. It's ridiculous, but it will fit on here. I'm actually missing one mount to put it on, so I haven't done any test images, but when I do, I'll put up some images of that, but it's again, very crazy. So that's kind of the nice things, that you have all these other additional options Ooh, that would have been bad. You have all these additional options that you wouldn't have had with lens choices. So I'm going to open this up actually on the back so you can see how big this actually gets up. So again, gigantic lens. And this actually goes down from f1 to f22. So it'll get very, very sharp. If I change the lenses here, let's do this. So again, something that's an additional option that you wouldn't have had maybe with something else. You know, that's actually kind of the power of the whole interchangeable lens, is that you can go buy different lenses and find mounts and adapters and put them on and do stuff. And it helps give some flexibility to these systems, especially for these Q mount systems. It turns a simple 8mm to 48mm, 8 to 48mm lens, which by itself was, it was pretty nice and pretty crazy, but cropped in with the Q's small sensor, it magnifies the range into a super power telephoto lens that can be kind of fit in your pocket-ish, or carry along, and you can pretty much take this and one of the lens and be done, and get everything that you want to do, and get a lot of the field. Now, of course, with these, you don't get your autofocus, you're pretty much shooting in all manual mode, but for someone like me who's used to shooting in manual and adjusting your focal length and aperture and things like that anyway, it's not really a big deal. For more novice users who aren't sure, this is probably not your best bet. You probably want to wait till Pentax releases some more lenses, but I think Pentax did a good job. They came out with 5 lenses to show they had strong support for the mount, and it really shows in the quality of all the things, and everything works well. The fisheye lens, by the way, is great. Really useful. I'm really glad I got this. Totally worth it if you can get this. Worth the $130. Hopefully it'll be cheaper by Christmas, by the time they come. Alright, so one more thing is about the battery life of the camera. Pentax rated about 200 to 300 shots, which is about what I'm getting, but the battery life is okay. I'd recommend getting another battery. They're about $20 for a third-party one, or a $40 for a standard one. And the one other thing is that you can actually get this camera to be near silent. If you turn on the electric shutter instead of the lens shutter that's on these lenses, you can also shoot at 1/8000th of a second, which is great. And you can turn off your sound effects from the one is the sound setting menu. So if I go back in here, go to sound effects, turn this volume all the way down, turns everything off, or you can just turn off the in focus or however you want to do it. But let's say we turned everything off. It's great. And then you're going to go back to the custom menu on the second page, which is over here, and you can see I've already got it enabled, which turns on the electric shutter. It says even when using a lens that has a lens shutter, it will use electronic shutter. Well, not exactly, because I just tested this. I was verifying it again just to make sure I'm not crazy. But if I shoot at 2,000 of a second, let's get the focus. You hear the shutter go off. You hear that little click. If I shoot above it, which is where it would need the lens, the electric viewfinder shutter to go off, it's dead silent. So, well, as long as you're under 2,000 of a second, it's the regular shutter. But if you're over it, yeah, dead silent. No sound whatsoever. So maybe they need to fix that, or maybe that's a little adjustment. Not a big deal, because even the lens shutter that's on the lens is pretty quiet. So, but just something to mention for these cameras. And so just to review about everything that we've talked about, the Q, great camera, I love it. It really is a pocket SLR. It does everything that it needs to do. It's built really well, has a lot of features and a lot of custom options, exactly what you find in a good standard SLR these days. It's designed really well, extremely usable, very adjustable to how you want to shoot. Images are great, wonderful, especially if you do RAW, you'll get really high quality images. You have a range of lens choices, and if those aren't good enough, you have options to add adapters to mount K-mount lenses and C-mount lenses and D-mount lenses and things like that that are already on eBay to give it more flexibility. There's really nothing not to like about the Q other than the couple things I mentioned earlier, which is the AF speed sometimes in low light, which ends up being as good as a penguin shoot, the lack of shallow depth field unless you buy crazy lenses like this, and obviously the burst rate is probably the only thing you can't really fix too much with the camera. That's kind of stuck where it is. Unless there's a firmware update that magically fixes it, it's pretty much stuck at 5. So really, other than that, really worth it, because that's the only thing I can really say that's negative about the camera. Now, you might be saying, well, what about the price? Yes, this is a premium product. It's retails for about $800. The prices have already slowly started come down. But I personally thought that was high at first when I first bought it. But at that time, I was like, you know what? It seems like a good product. I'll give it a try. But now after seeing Nikon's pricing for their similar mirrorless cameras, this is actually actually compared to that, it's perfectly in line because the Nikon ones are mostly plastic. They do have a little bit of metal on one of the sides, but they're mostly plastic sides. They start at $650 for the entry-level model. It's $900 for their enthusiast model, which is what I would compare this to. And the lenses are ranging from $250, $300 to $250 to $300 per lens. Which, yes, this is $300 with a nice zoom, but these are $130, and they also have ones for two other lenses for $90. Okay, that's for me. That's a little bit lower pricing level to help people get into really buying more lenses into the system and committing to themselves. Also, the image quality coming from that so far, with their new 1-inch sensor from the Nikon, haven't heard that is obviously it takes good pictures, but I haven't heard it's as amazing as it was hyped up to be. I feel like maybe that camera got a little overhyped, but I'm still waiting to hear some reviews, so can't say for sure. But so far, early reviews are saying that the image quality isn't super spectacular. The Q though is definitely surprising. Like again, theory-wise, we would say the Q's image quality should be really bad and poor, but in reality, it's actually excellent and very good. And because of the smaller sensor size, it gives you that extra zoom, and it allows you to make pocketable lenses. The Nikon's lenses for that mirrorless Nikon J1 and V1 are much bigger, which again, that's part of the problem with some of the Sony mirrorless camera. The other ones is you get these nice compact bodies, look great, and then you have these gigantic lenses coming out of it that don't make it any better than what your SLR was. So if you want something compact, this is your best mini compact SLR that you can get. And again, for the price, for me, this was worth it. I would pay the same price again if I had to, because after using it and actually playing around with it, it totally is worth having a small pocket camera that does everything I want to do, fits, and I can carry additional lenses without having to worry about it, versus carrying something this gigantic and never taking it with me anywhere to take photos. So again, overall, love the camera. I'm sure prices will come down, and as more competition comes in, I'm sure we'll see more and more updates. But as it is right now, this is actually a great camera, and a lot of people that have been reviewing this so far and actually using it have loved it. And just to mention again, remember, this thing has a full hot shoe flash, which the Nikons do not have. So I can use my $400 Pentax flash on this and start going crazy with it. And I did. Actually went earlier, took a bunch of shots with it. It's great. It works just like my SLR, just shrunk down. So I'm really happy that I'm not limited. Pentax did not limit you in any way to not being able to use a camera like you'd want to. They really did a good job. So again, wonderful camera. Really happy about that they made this out. I'm very surprised. Was not expecting it to be this way when they first announced it, but did a great job.